Alright, so let's talk about chapter 14, which is on coral reefs. We are skipping chapters 10 through 13 because a lot of that material can be covered in my oceanography class. So if you guys want to learn more about the different regions within the ocean, then I highly suggest you take OCN 201 next semester or whenever. Alright. So coral reefs are complex areas in the ocean that have been akin to rainforests and land, right? Because of the biodiversity and the amount of organisms found on coral reefs, you can't find that anywhere else except for in a rainforest on land. Reef building corals provide the framework in a community, so much like in the rainforest, the trees provide that framework. In the ocean, it's the coral reefs that do that. So corals, what are corals? Primarily, they are small little polyps. They are cnidarians. And so the group in which these organisms are found in is the anthozoans from Cnidaria. And these guys stay in their polyp form for their entire life. They don't do a medusa phase like the regular jellyfish do. And the polyps then they grow on top of a main structure which is formed out of calcium carbonate. Coral polyps also have a very interesting symbiotic relationship with a type of dinoflagellate algae known as zooxanthellae, and the zooxanthellae and the coral polyp help each other in creating that calcium carbonate structure for the corals. So essentially, without this symbiotic relationship, you wouldn't have corals. Alright, so how do corals reproduce? So they can do three main types of reproduction. The most common type is asexual reproduction, where a polyp just splits itself into two, makes a clone of itself, and now you have two identical individuals. And that's typically what you'll see on the head of the coral. All of the individuals on one coral head are all the same individuals. Now, two different coral heads could be different individuals as long as they didn't do the second type of reproduction, which is fragmentation. If coral A fragmented, a piece of its coral broke off, landed right next to it, and starts to grow, which is how they reproduce coral in a sense. So if you have coral head A and coral head B, the individuals on both of those corals will be identical because they came from the same original coral head. The only way you can get to biodiversity is through sexual reproduction, which happens only once a year, usually somewhere between August and September, when the water temperature is at its warmest. And corals are what's known as broadcast spawners. So they release both gametes into the water column, so both sperm and egg, and they do have receptors on the sperm and the egg to indicate that they are from the same coral head, so they don't fertilize each other. Hopefully they fertilize a sperm or an egg from a different coral head. Then it turns into a planula, and then eventually it tries to find someplace suitable to land. And once it finds someplace suitable that hasn't already been occupied, it will metamorphose into a mini coral and start growing. So here is the main structure of a polyp. So you can see the polyp itself sits on what's known as a basal plate, and that's where it grows from. So it deposits calcium carbonate there at the basal plate, and it sits on top of the theca. The theca is basically just a calcium carbonate skeleton. And the structure of the polyp itself is pretty similar to all other cnidarians that are polyps. So they have tentacles so that they can catch food. They have a mouth, they have a stomach, but they have some other stuff like an outer epidermis, a gastrodermis, a mesoglea, a septum, and a choanosarc. Choanosarc is basically just a tissue that connects each polyp together. Okay, so in this particular diagram, I would probably stress on the main parts like the basal plate, the theca, the tentacle, the mouth, and the stomach. Those would be the main things that I'd want you to know about this. Okay, so how do corals get their nutrients, or nutrition, I should say? Majority of the corals get, I would say, about 90% of their energy from the zooxanthellae. Zooxanthellae are photosynthetic, so during the daytime they are pumping out energy as fast as they can, and while they are taking in the carbon dioxide that the polyp releases, the zooxanthellae then returns the glucose that it creates from photosynthesis back to the coral polyp so that it can get enough energy needed. So it's a cycle. Coral polyp gives the zooxanthellae CO2 that it needs, and the zooxanthellae gives the coral polyp glucose, which it needs. Right? So that's why it's a mutualistic or symbiotic relationship, because both parties in this relationship are benefiting in some way. The polyp does eat detritus or anything that floats by its tentacles, detritus and zooplankton. So pretty much anything it can get its tentacles on, it will eat. But another way, this is typically not the primary way it uses to get nutrition, but it can as a byproduct, and I will show you a video of this later on. But corals can get nutrients from their mesenterial filaments, and this is essentially filaments that can be found in their stomach. And what they do is they bring it out of their stomach and shoot it over at the neighboring coral, and those filaments have digestive enzymes on them. So essentially what they're doing is they're spitting out their stomach, digesting their neighbor, and taking the nutrients from them. So pretty gruesome way of getting nutrients, but that's one way. It's not a very common way again. They primarily will get their nutrients from the zooxanthellae or from their tentacles. So to further explain the zooxanthellae polyp relationship, so when you look in the epidermis of the coral polyp, you can see what's going on here. So on the right hand image there, you can see a zoomed in, let's just say a zoomed in image of the zooxanthellae. And so the zooxanthellae is a circle in green, and what I've highlighted here is that this is a very efficient way of recycling material, because nothing in this reaction here is wasted. So you can see on the left hand side you have carbon dioxide and water and nutrients that diffuses into the zooxanthellae, which is needed for photosynthesis. Zooxanthellae can also get carbon dioxide and water from outside of the coral polyp, which then diffuses through the coral polyp skin, as well as the how do you say, the membrane of the zooxanthellae as well too. And so with sunlight, when sunlight hits that, it does photosynthesis and creates glucose, or what they're calling organic matter, and oxygen. And so that oxygen and glucose then diffuses back into the polyp, which is what it needs. And as that polyp is respiring, it converts that organic matter and oxygen into carbon dioxide and water. So it's a constant cycle, but a very efficient one. Okay, so conditions for reef growth. So you need these two main conditions in order for corals to grow. And the main one is you need light, because you need to be able to power the zooxanthellae in a sense. And you also need to have the right temperature. And the temperature is needed for reproduction. So remember I told you that corals only reproduce once a year, and they reproduce in August or September when the temperature is the warmest. But that's not to say that it's the warm, like super hot water. Corals will typically spawn at around 80 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. But typically what we've been experiencing lately are temperatures up in like the 90s, 95 temperature range, and that's a little bit too warm for corals. And when that happens, they tend to bleach. And so when they bleach, they are losing their zooxanthellae, which I'll show you in a little bit. But they need enough light in order to get the energy needed to reproduce, and then they need the right temperature. There is a pretty narrow range of temperatures in which corals can survive in. They can't survive in too cold of water, so I think if it's below 75 degrees or something, they don't do very well. And then if it's definitely above like 85 degrees, they definitely don't do well either. So coral bleaching is when the coral polyps how do you say, there's the expulsion of zooxanthellae from the polyps. Sorry about that, it's early. And this is typically caused when you have higher than normal temperatures. So like I was saying, generally speaking, it's like 90 or higher when corals typically will bleach. But essentially, you shouldn't use that number. You should typically just use it higher than normal temperature. So whatever the normal temperature is in that given area, you have to kind of just like bump that temperature up pretty high. And generally, it's caused by El Nino. It's because of the effects of El Nino. That's typically when they first started seeing these occurrences. And if the temperature where the coral is at persists, then the coral typically does not recover and then will die. But if conditions go back to normal, then the coral can reincorporate the zooxanthellae within its skin and recover from those conditions. And a lot of times, corals can adapt to these rising temperatures by incorporating different types of zooxanthellae after they've bleached. And so there are what they're finding, different types of zooxanthellae. Some of them are more heat resistant than others. And so if a coral is able to reincorporate those more heat resistant type of zooxanthellae, then it should have a better time surviving the next heat wave, so to say. Okay, another thing that really damages corals are salinity, changes in salinity, sedimentation, and pollution. And so typically corals cannot handle lower salinity waters or suspended solids. So when you have a large rainstorm event and it pushes a lot of fresh water into the coastal ocean. That fresh water floats on top of the salt water, but if you have a coral that is pretty close to the surface of the water, those parts of the coral that touches that freshwater lens will have a very hard time surviving, and maybe part of that coral will die. If suspended solids or sedimentation covers the corals, like you see in the image there, that doesn't allow the coral or the coral polyps to be able to get any nutrients or to get any sunlight. So in a way, it's kind of suffocating itself when sedimentation covers a coral like that. And so that's typically why you don't find corals near river mouths, because river mouths tend to have a lot of sedimentation. Any silt that gets into the water that kind of just floats around. I don't know if you can see in that image, but if you look on the top right hand corner, you can kind of see how murky that water is. And when that happens, that reduces the amount of sunlight that reaches the coral, which then could affect the photosynthesis process. And so because of all of this, corals can be very sensitive to pollution in the coastal region. So that's another reason why we should try to minimize the amount of pollution that gets into the ocean. All right, so with all of that said, there's a really good case study in Kaneohe here in Hawaii. So in Kaneohe Bay, back in the early 50s, treated sewage, I don't know if you could say it's treated, but that's what the textbook says. Treated sewage was dumped into the bay until about the 70s and didn't stop until the 80s. And so this is just constant everyday, dumping of sewage into the bay. So before the sewage was dumped into the bay, this Kaneohe Bay was a huge sanctuary for fish and coral and other organisms. And my dad used to tell me stories about how beautiful it used to be. But once they started pouring sewage into the bay, what happened was nitrification or eutrophication occurred. And that's essentially when you add too many nutrients into the ocean, and that leads to accelerated algae growth. Because algae is getting an excess amount of nutrients, it outcompetes the corals and grows much faster than the coral can. So in a sense, it starts to suffocate the corals, and that's why when you go swimming in Kaneohe Bay now, you see probably coral, but then you also see like huge patches of algae everywhere on top of the coral. And then also too, it can be kind of murky because of all that sedimentation and suspended solids that was dumped into the bay. It caused the bay to turn very murky. So on really bad days, it's really bad. Like in this photo right here, this is what's known as a super sucker, and it's a project where they go out into the bay and physically suck up or vacuum up all of the algae that they can with this hose here. And on this particular day that the image was taken, this wasn't a bad day. You can actually see almost to the end of this patch reef. There are days where if you were to take this photo on these really murky days, you wouldn't be able to see the coral right behind the guy's arm. So it can get pretty bad. Once the sewage was diverted from Kaneohe Bay, the reef started coming back pretty quickly because the algae did not have that excess of nutrients. But it took quite a hit when Hurricane Eva came by. And so those corals are still trying to make a comeback even after being damaged by the hurricane. So you can see here the organisms within Kaneohe Bay are surviving as best they can. You can see this spotted pufferfish on the left hand side there, living within the coral and the algae. So he's making a habitat for himself there. On the right hand side there, that's an image of a patch reef in Kaneohe Bay, and you can see that one is doing fairly well. There's a lot of coral right there, so at least it hasn't been overtaken by too much algae. There was a project that I was a part of that tried to reseed Kaneohe Bay with this urchin right here. This urchin is known as Trypnustes gratilla. It is a native urchin to Hawaii, and what we were doing was we were trying to raise and mass release these guys into Kaneohe Bay to try to control the algae overgrowth. And these particular urchins are not very picky eaters, if you could say, and they'll eat just about any algae they can get their hands on. They do prefer some algae over others, typically the native algae, but they will eat the invasive one. So that image on the right hand side there of that huge lump of algae on top of the coral, that algae is known as Euchema capophycus, and that algae is very invasive. And these guys will actually go over there and attack that giant ball of algae. It will take them a while to eat it all if they even get to that point. But you can see on the bottom left-hand image there they are placed on top of a reef, and they're just going for it. The only problem is they tend to die off pretty quickly within Kaneohe Bay, and I don't think anybody knows why, because they used to be found in this bay in quite abundance, but who knows. Alright, so there are 3 main types of reefs, and all of the reefs that you see around the world start off with fringing reefs. Fringing reefs are the reefs that you find around islands or coastlines. So here in Hawaii, all of our reefs are known as fringing reefs because they're attached to the coastline of the island. Once that island starts to sink and isn't growing anymore, that reef will stay put. It's not going to go anywhere, but the island is going to continue to sink. So there's going to start to get there's going to be a lagoon between the reef and the island itself. So that's when you get a barrier reef. So you can see that primarily in Australia with the Great Barrier Reef and some other places too. And then you can see atolls. Atolls are what's left behind once the island completely sinks, and so you still have the coral reef there, and it basically shows like a footprint of what the island used to be like. So let's go over each one separately. So fringing reefs are the most common reefs that you see in the ocean. They develop along the shoreline of land and islands, and they need hard substrate in order for the larvae to settle. So they can't just settle in the sand, even though it may look that way when you go out to the beach. It actually needs some sort of rock in order to settle. And so when you look at this image down here, you can see if you start at the beach rock and you make your way out, fringing reefs, typically you'll see either mangroves or other vegetation along the coastline. You'll see some sort of lagoon, but that lagoon is going to be pretty shallow and pretty narrow. And then you'll see the reef. So you'll have the reef flat, which is on the top, and then the reef crest, which is the part of the reef where a lot of the wave energy hits. Then you have barrier reefs, and these are where the coastline have separated from the coastline has moved away basically, and left the coral behind. So the lagoon that separates the coastline from the reef is pretty wide and can be very deep. In this image here, if we start by the beach side, you got your lagoon. A lot of times you'll have coral knolls or pinnacles, so just like patches of corals. You'll have a back reef slope, you'll have a reef flat, and you'll have a reef crest. Sometimes you can get a sandbar, which they're calling a sand K. You can have spurs and grooves, where you have material carving its way through the coral, going down into the deep ocean. And then you'll have the fore reef slope. So the fore reef typically will have coral species that can deal with high wave energy, because all of the wave energy will be hitting the fore reef and dissipating there. And then by the time you get to the back reef, that's where you typically see your more delicate type corals, because they don't experience that heavy wave action as the fore reef does. And then lastly, you have atoll. This is a ring of reef around a central lagoon. So there is no island. In this case, the island has completely sunk. Atolls tend to be far from land, so typically you'll see them in the middle of the ocean, because continents don't create atolls, only islands do. And atolls used to be fringing and barrier reefs at one point in time, but now, because the island has sunk in completely, it's just a reef that's left over. And so within the lagoon itself, you'll have what's known as a back reef. That's where you'll see your more delicate type corals. And then you have the reef flat, which is typically where you'll tend to see between the lagoon, or between the ocean and the land. And then you'll have your reef crest, where it comes up, and then your fore reef, where you have your more sturdier corals that can handle the wave action. And then competition. So corals have to compete for space. Space is a limiting factor on coral reefs. And so in order to do that, they develop different ways of either growing faster or different type of branches. So in this particular case, you can see there are 5 different types of branching type, you could say. And so you'll see some that make table, so tabular coral. So they'll spread out really wide so they can try to capture as much sunlight as possible. And anything that starts to grow under them will eventually die, because they won't be able to get any sunlight. You'll have your branching coral, so they can branch out, if you want to say, and try to take up as much space that way. Branching coral tend to be a very fast growing coral as well too. Then you'll have your massive coral. So these are just your brain coral. Basically, they just get really, really big and take up a lot of space. You can get your foliose coral, so they kind of look like flowers. And if they just kind of keep growing like that, they'll have more space for collecting sunlight. And then you can have encrusting coral. So this one basically takes up any of the extra space that it can. So on this slide here is a video of corals fighting for space. So why don't you take a few minutes to watch this coral. You may need to pause this recording, because I'm just going to keep on going. But pause this recording, take a look at this video here. I will post the PowerPoint in the resources tab in La Lima, so that you can actually watch this video. It's pretty interesting, and essentially this is where those mesenterial filaments come into play. And so you'll see how they actually attack their neighboring corals so they can get more space. All right, so pause. All right. Okay, so now that you've watched that, hopefully you found that pretty interesting. So moving on, we'll talk about the coral food web. And corals and algae are at the bottom of the food web. So they would be known as your primary producers because they both photosynthesize and produce energy. Uh, all organisms within this food web contribute to the detritus pool. But then you get up to your primary consumers, which are your urchins, your fishes, your sea cucumbers, your sea stars, crabs. Uh, yeah. So you got your different types. You got your grazers, your detritus feeders, your coral mucus feeders, and your plankton feeders. So they all will feed off of different types. So your grazers will feed off of the algae, whereas your plankton feeders will feed off of the plankton. Your coral and coral mucus feeders will feed off of the coral, and your detritus feeders will feed off of the detritus that everybody's creating. And then you have your secondary consumers, which are your predators, and those eat the primary consumers, and so forth and so forth. So this entire food web right here is in balance with each other. And once you take out an organism from this food web, the entire thing it becomes unbalanced. So if you introduce too many nutrients and you get an explosion of seaweed, then you decrease the box of the corals, and grazers will have a hard time keeping up with the algae. So all of this just becomes imbalanced. Or if you take away your predators, like you eat all the sharks, then you don't have anybody to control the primary consumers, the fishes and the sea stars and whatnot. So those guys explode and then pretty much destroy the primary producers. So I hope you guys got kind of understand that a little bit more. Let me know if you don't. But basically, everything is balanced in the ocean. And so there are a couple of organisms that do prey on corals. So you have coral-eating snails. They will actually eat the polyps on the corals. You have the crown of thorns sea star, which also eats the polyps on the corals. That's the middle image right there. Pretty gnarly looking guy. When these guys explode in population, corals really suffer. Then you have urchins. They actually graze on the algae on the coral, but then as they're grazing on the algae, they tend to damage the coral themselves. So when there's an explosion of these guys, it can be very bad. And then certain fishes, like the bottom left-hand image there, those are butterfly fish, and they can do some pretty serious damage when they get too populous, I guess you can say. Okay. And then lastly, you can have some symbionts on the coral. So you can have crustaceans that live within the coral to protect the coral from predators. So let's just say a crown of thorns sea star makes its way over coral, and let's just say this coral has a crab living within it that protects it. It will pinch the bottom of that crown of thorns sea star until it moves away. So that's pretty handy. Then you can have anemone fish living in anemones, and the anemone protects the fish, and the fish protects the anemone from being predated on. Then you can have cyanobacteria that live within the coral, and then you can have zooxanthellae. So the image on the bottom right-hand corner there, that's an image of a hermit crab that has a symbiotic relationship with an anemone. So that one's pretty interesting. That particular hermit crab can have as many as like 3 or 4 anemones on its shell. And that hermit crab tends to be a messy eater. And so when it eats, it doesn't eat everything. So a lot of the particles goes to the anemone that are on the shell of the crab. And if that crab were to be attacked, the anemone can protect it by stinging its predator. Okay, so that was chapter 14. So stay tuned for, I think we're skipping up over to chapter 17, which will be on marine resources. All right.